In this video, we are going to talk about governing the charter school. And we're going to talk about a way to ensure that your governance board meets its obligations under state and federal law and meets its obligations under your charter contract. So we talked in the last video about the fact that governance boards are subject to state and federal laws. They're subject to obligations that are set forth in the charter contract. And what do they do to meet those obligations? How do you set up a system of governance in a charter school? And one of the ways, just like a school district, one of the ways to do that is to develop and implement a strong set of policies that allows the governance board of the charter school to delineate what the school's missions and goals are, so that those are specific and set forth so everybody knows what they are, to provide clear direction to administration, to staff and students, to ensure consistency in decision making. So when a student violates a code of conduct, for example, you want to ensure that you are responding to that violation in the same way each time, so that there's consistent discipline issued or there's a consistent response. You want to provide efficiency in the charter school operations. You don't want to have to reinvent the wheel every time an issue comes up. You want to have those issues that you know are going to be coming up again and again in terms of obligations, in terms of operations. You want those spelled out so it's easy and it's efficient to determine what to do. Sometimes you want to use them to clarify the governing board's position on a particular issue. What is the governing board's position on the use of cell phones in schools? What's the governing board's position on whether or not a parent who comes into an IEP meeting can record it? The policies are a way to set forth what the governing board's positions are on certain issues. And last and really not least is a strong set of policies really gives credibility to the board and to the administration. A lot of times when we talk about charter schools, and we know that when the public talks about charter schools, there's somewhat of a misconception that these are public schools, because they are run by independent entities or separate non-stock corporations and not by an elected school board. The public tends to feel that there just isn't the transparency there. And I think I've certainly heard that a number of times. But when you have a strong set of policies and you follow them and you implement them, it gives credibility to the board and the administration and to the charter school. And it lets the public know, we have policies, we've thought about these, this is how our school runs, this is what we follow, this is how we ensure we comply with the laws and with our charter contract. So I think a strong set of policies really can do both helping you operate the school efficiently and also really just making a statement that you are transparent and that you have the framework set up to have a successful school. So when you talk about policies, let's move into that. What is a policy? Well, a policy is really a governing document for an organization, and it establishes the broad and general positions the organization will take on important issues. It can set goals for the organization, and it's really an effort to explain what the organization wants, why, and to what extent. Certainly, charter schools are required to have certain policies by law. If you look in the statute, you have to have a non-discrimination policy. And what might that look like? Well, a non-discrimination policy can be very, very simple and essentially say, the such and such charter school will not discriminate in any of its programs, activities, extracurricular, non-extracurricular, based upon any disability or based upon sex or gender identity or whatever it may be. The policy essentially sets forth the principle that the governance board and the charter school essentially lives by. And policies are living documents. They should be periodically reviewed, particularly because in this political climate, sometimes with the administration that is in office, whether it be in Wisconsin or whether it be in the federal government, rules and regulations of agencies change. So policies should be reviewed periodically and reflect those changes. Sometimes policies are reviewed and change to reflect changes in the organization, how it runs and what its priorities are. But the one thing is while you do want to do periodic review, and while you certainly want the understanding that a policy can change, you don't want a policy to change with each incoming board or when the board has a big shift and a turnover. You don't want all of those policies to look very different, because you want to have in place a set of policies that are long-term governance documents, so that students, staff, parents, the community can rely on them and know what those policies say and know that those will be consistently applied today and next year. So where do you begin when you talk about policies? Well, what resources do you have? I would say you want to start out in thinking about having policies in place for how your board is going to be governed. Now, you have bylaws if you're a non-stock entity as a governance board, but in terms of who speaks for the board to the public, does any member of the governance board, can they put out a press release on behalf of the board? Generally, no. Certainly in school district, public school district governance, policies oftentimes say the president of the board speaks for the board. That action that's taken is only taken by the board as a whole. One individual governance board member or one individual school board member doesn't have authority to act for the board. So those types of things. What happens if a seat is somebody leaves the governance board? While your bylaws probably address that as well, maybe you want to provide additional provisions in your board governance documents in terms of how that seat is filled. You want to look at policies with respect to your students. What are the policies? What's the code of conduct? Can students, as we talked about before, have cell phones? What's the policy if a student has a complaint that they have been harassed by another student? What if there's been inappropriate conduct with a faculty member? What are those policies? Policies with respect to personnel, particularly if you are a non-instrumentality authorized by a school district, or if you are a 2X or a 2R charter school, you're going to want to have personnel policies. What are your policies with respect to sick days? What are your policies with respect to benefits and all those sorts of things? Policies with respect to school and community. Do you allow visitors to come into your school at any time? Do you have policies regarding that? What about volunteers? Do you have volunteer policies? What if you have a parent in the community that complains about something that you're teaching in your curriculum? Do you have a policy that says, hey, if you have a complaint about this, here are the steps you need to take to lodge that complaint, and here's how we will hear it, and here's how we will resolve it. So all of those sorts of kind of issues that come up fall underneath, I would say, at least probably one of those bullet points when you talk about board policies. I won't go into a lot of specific detail with respect to how do you draft a policy, but I do want to point out, when you're looking at putting policies in place, you want to ensure that there's consistent decision making. So you want to be sure that if you have a policy that deals with sexual harassment for students, and you have a policy that deals with sexual harassment for employees, you want consistency in those. What is the process? What are the steps that you take? How do you define sexual harassment? If you have policies in your athletic code and you have policies in your board policies that talk about the same subject matter, be sure those are consistent. One of the things that we see a lot is, and it's happened a number of times, is that you may be dealing with an issue and you look at the board policy and it's a little bit different than the policy in the handbook. And then it's a little bit different than the policy that may be in a contract. So each of those are the language in a contract. So you want to be sure that there's consistent policies, consistent board statements across all school environments. You want a policy to provide clear direction. You want to make sure it's legally compliant. So you want to be checking with legal counsel or making sure you're subscribing to one of the policy organizations that is checking that for you. You want it to be realistic. You want it to provide accountability for the board, the employees, and students. You want it to convey only what's necessary. You know, the worst thing is to find a policy that has been enacted that's 7 pages. Nobody's going to read the 7 pages. The whole point of it is lost, and there's just opportunity for not meeting every different piece of the policy. The policies should anticipate the future a little bit. You know, you don't want a policy that only applies at this moment and isn't going to be applicable a year from now. So when you talk about, you may not have any service dogs, for example, in your school, but certainly it's an obligation that you are required to meet under the ADA for students with disabilities. So in the event someone comes forward and makes a request for a service animal, it may be smart to consider having a policy on that so that there's a go-to policy with respect to it. What shouldn't be in a policy? What shouldn't a policy have? Well, it shouldn't be an administrative rule, and let me explain that a little bit. I mentioned in the last slide where a policy isn't effective if it's 7 pages long. Well, we'll take that back a little bit when you talk about open enrollment policies. Do tend to be a bit longer. But a policy sort of sets forth those basic governing principles. If you want to have specific procedures, then put those specific procedures in an administrative rule. Those can include the nuts and bolts of how a general policy is going to be implemented. In some school districts, administrative procedures are on the website with the policy, and the board approves administrative procedures also. In some districts, administrative procedures are procedures that are developed by the administration, and the board gives the administration the ability to interpret the policy and put in place rules and regulations to implement it. So you can do a whole host of things as a governance board and decide how you're going to handle that. But a policy shouldn't be a cut and paste job from some other organization. I definitely encourage you as a governance board in your administration to be looking at other school district policies online and how other organizations and schools have dealt with those. But you want to be sure that what you are putting in your policies applies to your school. I have seen a number of times where I will look at a policy and I'll say to a district, is this how you handle these things, and who is your compliance officer? And as it turns out, it really isn't how it's handled. And so because it was sort of cut and paste from another entity. So be sure that what you have is applicable to your school. And as I said in the last slide, the policy, it shouldn't serve the individual desire of the current board members. Remember, it is a policy that is intended to be applicable to the organization. So in policymaking, sort of this last sum it up, have a process for adopting policies. Who's going to draft the policy? Do you have a committee to review it? Does the board review it once? Do they have a second reading so they have the opportunity to make changes? Make sure that your governance board is reviewing the policies carefully. I find sometimes policies are enacted and then later on an issue comes up and a board doesn't want to take some sort of action, and I have to remind them, look, last year you adopted this policy, and within this policy, this is what you said. And sometimes that's a surprise. So just be sure that you are adopting policies that the board has really reviewed, because the policies can extend a governance board's obligations, and you want to ensure they recognize that. Finally, the last and probably one of the most important rules certainly is that once you do establish a policy, it is imperative that you follow it. Because when a student, say for example, receives a violation of the code of conduct, you want to be sure that you are following whatever policy and procedure that you have in place in addressing that. It's the reason why you have them, and you want to be sure that you know them and are applying them.